A little while back we made a video about the Severn estuary and its wildly dangerous crossing points, but if you head upstream up the River Severn, it turns out that was the tip of the iceberg, because today's video contains stories of underground lost rivers, abandoned tunnels, millennia old dangerous crossing points and ferries. So join me today, Paul, as we head on up the River Severn. Speaking of icebergs, well, the River Severn actually used to flow both north and south. The northern section used to flow into the Irish Sea via the Dee estuary. This was up until the last ice age, when it's believed that there was a significant glacial lake to the west of Shrewsbury. Either the breaking of this lake or the overflowing of geological action caused the formation of the Iron Bridge Gorge. This then connected with the start of the River Severn, and it formed the River Severn that we know today. Today's journey starts here, just a few miles up from the Severn estuary, and we're in a bit that's probably about 80 to 100 yards wide. Now, this is Minster Werf and Minster Werf Bore Viewpoint. It's one of the few places on this planet which pay host to a natural phenomenon with just the right conditions for something called a tidal bore. Now, it's mid-February and there's no report of a bore going to happen again until March the 4th, when that's what they call a 3-star bore. Obviously that's marked out of 5. Now, you need the right conditions. You need a full moon, but you don't only need a full moon, you need a full moon in the right position, presumably right above us, because what happens is 5 miles wide worth of estuary back there crams itself into 100 yards just here. So perfect tidal conditions, perfect moon alignment, and you get what is called a tidal bore. And the world record, I believe, for surfing on this bore is around about 7.5 miles up to Maze Bridge, and it stops there. You can go no further for reasons which we will come to shortly. But for the meantime, on to more pressing matters. When I was researching all these different stories along the River Severn as we head up towards Shrewsbury, quite a few of them sort of blew my mind a bit, and the one coming up right here is definitely one of those. So Tewkesbury is probably about 4 miles to our south in the distance, and just up ahead of us is a small town called Upton-on-Severn. Now, if you have a look at an OS map before we get there, you'll see on the east side of the river a small holding called Saxon Lode. Now, Saxon's Lode, just across the river there, gives us our first indication of the massive history that's right here in this area. You see, because Saxon's Lode was mentioned in a 1086 Domesday Book entry for the town of Upton-on-Severn, and it was said that the Lord of Saxon's Lode was said to have the responsibility to the king of protecting the entire area of Wessex from invasion from the Vikings from the north. So you can see what a huge importance this area had, and Saxon's Lode. Now, Saxon itself probably referred to an ancient ferryman, Saxon being their name, I would guess, but right here is probable where there would have been a crossing point. But nevertheless, it is still conjecture. What's not conjecture, however, is just here 100 yards ahead of me is an old railway viaduct, an abandoned railway viaduct, to the point it's not even there anymore, and we're just left with some embankments either side of where the Tewkesbury and Malvern Railway would have gone, carrying trains across here for 100 years or so. And all we're left with now, the other side, on the east side of the river, is a measuring station on the exact spot the viaduct would have been, and that measures water flow, I guess in sort of the tide times, and perhaps helps Environment Agency, people like that. So we're just coming into the southern part of Worcester now, below Buns Hill and Temerdine. And until the 20th century, there remained a ferry point, the Ketch Ferry. But perhaps more importantly here, earlier in 1651, Cromwell is said to have tied a number of boats together in order to reach both sides of the river on his assault on Worcester and the royalists that were camped both sides of the river. The Battle of Worcester, the last battle of the English Civil War. It's said that there are a number of small battles leading up to Worcester at all the various crossing points here. Now that leads us nicely into a type of crossing we've yet to come across, the ford. So this is Duck Brook, and a small stream or small brook coming out of the southeast of Worcester into the River Severn. Now, you used to be able to cross here on foot. Certainly the right time of year and the right conditions, there was a ford, a walkable point, gravelly across the river here. Now, looking at the river flow today, it's mid-January, it's extremely deep and very fast. I couldn't imagine doing that in a million years. So what changed here? While the Industrial Revolution took hold, and up and down this part of the country there was a growing need to guarantee the depth of the water. Now this is a huge tidal river, so it's very difficult to do that. Ultimately 7 locks would be built along its course, and the lower load one, being next to Tewkesbury, ultimately destroyed all the ancient ford crossings, and certainly the one back here at Duck Brook. Further north at Diglis Lock, well, it was built a few years before in 1844, and it remains the only double lock on the entire Severn. So let's head on upstream a bit more for some more obscure tales of aqueducts, secret caves and lost tunnels. I'm on the hunt for some caves on the side of the River Severn, known locally as Hermitage. Now, in its strictest sense, Hermitage means home of the hermit, and it was just that. One such hermit apparently was a monk called Layman, who wrote the Chronicle of British History. Fascinating stuff, and I think they're just down here ahead of me now, and in fact I can see them. So we scaled ourselves down the cliff edge, admittedly using some steps, and we found the secret caves, the Stourport Caves, known locally as Hermitage. Now, just through there, 50 yards away, is the crossing, the Severn crossing from many centuries gone by, and it's said to be one of the most important crossings on this route because it was said to have housed the route that went from London up into mid-Wales, a really important route. Now, across the way there, Hartlebury, Bishop Latimer said that he could lodge 500 men in order to catch thieves in this area, but he also said that the hermits should not be the masters of these caves. So he obviously felt quite strongly that they themselves may have been a little bit corrupt perhaps. So let's have a look inside. To think that these have been carved out hundreds of years ago and still survive today. All what appears to be like little rooms. I mean, up there's like a shaft. Quite an intricate system here for the sort of the clan or the group of people that lived here and spent their lives here, the hermits, and controlled the ferries for hundreds of years before perhaps more of a civilised society came along. So before we get to our next fascination, there was one place that we just didn't have time to visit, But have a look at this from Google Maps. Can you see it yet? That curious line that crosses the Severn here just to the northwest of Kidderminster. Well, it just disappears to its east. It seems to go nowhere. So I guess that pretty much rules out a railway, but what about to its west? Well, it looks like the line of trees here has purposely avoided whatever it is. But this is a big hill, so it rules out a canal and a railway. So it turns out that if you zoom in even closer, well, you get a further clue. These are what look like maybe pipelines. And indeed it is an aqueduct, part of a 73-mile route to supply water to Birmingham from the Elan Valley. The Elan Aqueduct, to be more precise, which transfers water by gravity. Now, that's a simple explanation for this, of course, so let's leave that story for another video in its own right. We're fast on our way to Shrewsbury now, but just a couple more tales to tell you before we get there. I could have picked probably 200 different stories. The next story is from Hampton Load and perhaps is one of the saddest stories that I found and caught in my net of interesting things. Because at Hampton Load there was said to be a ferry going back at least sort of 1600, 1500 and probably earlier. December the 13th, 1964, 3:25 p.m. and disaster struck for the ferry. It sank in high waters and unfortunately it killed the operator at the time. Looking at the fast flowing water ahead, it's not difficult to understand why he lost his life. A few years later, it's back up and running again, and it did so until 2007, when again high waters caused the operating here to stop. Thankfully, I think no one was injured at the time, but it was left in a bad way for a couple of years until 2009, and the Friends of the Hampton Load Ferry ran a charitable trust and got it working again, and they did so for 7 or 8 years. But the sad end to this tale is come 2016, for whatever reason, that group disbanded, and it's now no more. It's left in its abandoned state just up there. You've got the old jetty that would have come down to the edge and load into the water. You've got the large posts either side, and yeah, a 400 or 500 year history on this spot, this important crossing, and for the last 6 years it's out of use. So after leaving Hampton Load, there was one other place that we meant to visit, but we just didn't have time. So let's flip over to the canal section of Rail Map Online. Now this red line tells a wonderful story of what is essentially an underground canal. To the west of this canal, and the red line, which happens to be a tunnel, is Brook. You will have found some forges here in the late 1700s, and they needed to get their product to the River Severn for transportation. So there was one problem, which was a significant hill between the Brook and of course the Severn. A 750-yard tunnel was made, and that made up a good 3/4 of the length of the overall canal itself, carved here through the sandstone. Now back in 2017, the Shropshire Caving and Mining Club explored it. I think this was for the second time, as they did it back in 1966 as well. I'll leave the link to their amazing work in the description below, but suffice to say, this lost tunnel will again be a video in its own right. So we finally reached the medieval town of Shrewsbury. The light's fading fast, we haven't got much time, so we're going to tell you the more prominent stories rather than that of all the various fords and ferries that were here in the past. Now here, however, on Poplar Island, there is a really curious earthwork, and I think it's just ahead of me now. I've certainly passed some of it as I came in onto the island. Now it's called Barge Cut, and it basically chops off the end of this Poplar Island. Now it's been around again since medieval times, but why would you take a shortcut which would perhaps save you only around about 200 yards on this island? Here's the earthwork just in front of us. You can see it on the camera, but it goes down there and off into the trees where there's still water existing today. But look at it, you've only got 200 yards to the end of the island. Now, it's only when you look at a map and you try and understand some of the geography here that it all becomes a bit clear. An old riverbed. It turns out the course of the Severn used to continue north here at Poplar Island and take a huge loop up and back down again, rejoining the east side of Poplar Island. Now, that is a shortcut. Now, on the assumption that Shrewsbury grew up around the Severn and used it to trade, a shortcut here for barges and vessels alike would be absolutely perfect. Except everything I've just said doesn't really ring true, because the deviation the river took, which would have meant this shortcut would have made sense, well, that deviation took place between 10 and 6,000 years ago. So the cut here, what was that for? Why would you go to save maybe 200 yards on a journey when you could just let the vessel flow around the edge of Poplar Island? Well, it turns out there were some fishing weirs, and the cut was used to avoid those and stop the barges getting caught up in the nets. That simple. There is one last fascination with Poplar Island and the old loop of the river that used to head north here, and that's the story of a lost river, Shrewsbury's Lost River, which actually travels 40 metres under us right now. A study written in 2002 by David Pannant and Stuart Sutton looked at what was called the Solid Geology, and it's actually a contour. Here in Shrewsbury it's pretty much sea level. Now, when the ice sheet was here that we mentioned at the start of the video, it forced the flow of water down to that level under great pressure. Now, it probably arose near Iron Bridge Gorge. Now, with the water flowing deep underneath us now, a lot of the issues today with the town of Shrewsbury and its flood defences aren't necessarily just to do with the bulging River Severn. Of course, they're to do with what comes from underneath. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. I'll walk along the River Severn from Gloucester up to Shrewsbury, and we've probably told you maybe 6, 7, 8 tales from 50 or 60 that we could have picked, but these ones were just the ones that fell in my net. So if you like this video, perhaps go and watch our Severn Estuary video, the dangerous crossings of the Severn Estuary, and maybe there'll be a part 3 from the source of the River Severn one day up in Wales. But for the meantime, thanks for your time, thanks for watching, and if you like this, do click on the subscribe button and do all those lovely things you're supposed to do. And we'll see you next Sunday, 5 PM Greenwich Mean Time.